so that we sort of close to each other and not too far at the back. I know that backbenchers like... You can't get any more forward. No, definitely you can't. Unless you join the panel. I know some people like being backbenchers, but this is not the House of Commons. It's not profitable to be a backbencher here. So if you can come closer, that would be nice. And we'll get started soon. I also know that there's a bit of traffic getting inside the building, so maybe we'll give it another 2 minutes to just give people a chance to come in. How are you this morning? Hello. I know we were not sleeping together, so it's catch-up time. But good morning, good morning. I think let us try and get started so that we don't at the end say we didn't have enough time to have conversations and discussions. This is technical session number 6, and it's titled Framing and Enabling Strategy, Policies and Regulations, and it's enabled by our colleagues at the GIZ. That's why you've got nice notebooks, German branded. You know what they say about German machines. We're about to have one of those sessions. Our first panelist is Mr. Federico Villatico-Campbell, and he's an independent consultant focusing on climate change and net zero development pathways. Please, Federico, join us. There's a longer bio, but I think would be here much longer if I attempted to read it. But he has worked as a project engineer and manager for a number of things, so he'll tell you how to get things done. Prof. Simon Roberts is an international economics expert, and he straddles around competition economics and industrial development. So hopefully he'll address some of the key issues that came out yesterday. Is this going to be a competition? I've never seen such a new idea, innovation being touted in a kumbaya fashion. Like we're just all gonna get along. Like there's so much kumbaya about it. We're going to work together. It's going to be beautiful. Every country is going to do its own hydrogen. Anyway, it's my life choice to be provocative. And then we've got Dr. Grove Steyn. He's one of South Africa's leading infrastructure and regulatory economists. Please join us, Prof. Last but not least, Alexandria Kluwer is a partner at Allen and Overy's. Is that correct? Allen and Overy's. Not ovaries, guys. Not. Guys, some of you, and let me not be rude, let me keep quiet. I was going to say things about biological clocks and stuff. Global Projects, Energy, Natural Resources and Infrastructure Group, and is based in the Johannesburg office. So she advises people all over the world. So we'll get into this conversation because a lot was said yesterday, and one of the panels I chaired yesterday was, excuse me, was with the Director General for the Department of Mineral Resources and Energy. And he was quite clear that when they came up with the integrated resource plan 3 years ago, there was no hydrogen in the IRP of 2019. And it's still not there, of course, but there's a conference on hydrogen. So let's see how this conference can help to expedite some of these things. I won't say what I think is a function of. I've been asked to behave at this conference, so I'm trying very hard to behave. So I'm going to get my panel kicked off with a set of questions that they will then respond to. I think there is a mic somewhere. Is there a second mic, or do we only have one mic? Oh, okay, fantastic, fantastic. We'll share. We'll also share this one. They can share that side, that one, and we'll share this mic. And perhaps, Federico, I'll start off with you. Actually, maybe not. Maybe, nah. I'll start with Dr. Steyn. Particularly because South Africa is yet to articulate, hydrogen as part of its energy mix. So I do want to get your sense in terms of where does green hydrogen fit in? Well, when they went to COP27, it was there, even though it's not part of the policy framework. But it's one of these things that create unnecessary technicalities that can take you to court and litigation, because somebody can then say, what policy framework informs you going to COP27 and entering into an international agreement with green hydrogen when it's not articulated in your local policy framework? And so, therefore, one, where does green hydrogen, fit in insofar as its classification in the energy mix? And secondly, what are the technical and market-related regulations which will be relevant to the development of power sources for green hydrogen? Because supposedly the business case that is being made at this conference is that, well, for it to be green hydrogen, it also has to be powered by green energy. Otherwise it gets tainted, unless you're trying to achieve net zero. So just your thoughts on those two major aspects. I mean, energy mix, but also market-related and regulatory, technical and market-related regulations that will need to kick in.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah, so those are actually two very big questions, and I'm only going to touch on them very briefly, else I'll take up the whole meeting.
No, absolutely. I'm a timekeeper as well.
So I would say on the energy mix question, it's early days, right? So this is a great summit, and we are getting, as you say, very excited and a lot of kumbaya moments. I think the main reason why there's a lot of kumbaya here is because we are looking at the export markets primarily. A lot of this is driven by German and European interests. And of course, it then makes it easier for stakeholders locally to realize their common interests and to find ways of working together. We even heard yesterday about the Northern Cape and the Western Cape kind of, working together and maybe even reaching into Namibia, all of that. So that, I think, is actually a great opportunity for us to collaborate more effectively rather than thinking that this is a competition. But you also raised a question about the IRP. And just as somebody who's quite involved with energy planning, etc., the IRP is a 10-year time span. And from what we know, you can be pretty confident that if you update the IRP on a rational economic basis for the next 10 years, you should see no green hydrogen in the IRP. It's not economic to have it in power generation in the next 10 years, right? So just to say a little bit more about the role in our energy mix, what I think many stakeholders see is, of course, there are certain key areas and the hard to abate sectors that you would want to focus on, and in the beginning it certainly won't be electricity. Electricity we can replace coal power with renewables, so it's low-hanging fruit, and we know that's what we have to do. And of course, anyway, we can get into the storage issue. But the obvious demand for green hydrogen in the next 10 years in the South African economy is, of course, Sasol. Sasol faces enormous challenges. They've committed to decarbonizing 30% by the end of the decade. And I don't think anybody has quite yet figured out how they're going to achieve that, and that includes Sasol themselves. It's given that they are a producer of hydrocarbon-based products, both fuels and plastics and other chemicals, they are going to have to replace both the carbon and the hydrogen with green sources. So if you want to one word, Sasol. That's where it comes into the energy mix. And then after that, of course, it's things like steel making. Simon and I were just talking about steel, primarily as a reductant. And then later on, you're probably looking at fertilizer, ammonia, etc., etc. So I think I'll stop there on the energy mix, and I'm sure we can debate that. Then your question on regulation, technical and market-based regulation, and what we need to on that score to, I presume, to develop this green hydrogen sector. That's a huge area, and I'll maybe just throw a few stones in the water, and then we can debate that. So we've been producing hydrogen in South Africa for a long time, right? Sasol, I think, is probably one of the world's largest hydrogen producers. So on the technical side, in terms of probably safety and generally how to run a factory that produces hydrogen, I think we have probably most of the safety regulations in place. I think you're absolutely right when it comes to the certification issue. And that's important both because locally we want to know that our hydrogen is green, if we say it is green, so that it's recognized by our trading partners who buy the products that are made from our green hydrogen. And of course also if we want to export hydrogen derivatives into other markets like Europe, we need certification standards for the greenness of the hydrogen that is compatible with those in our target markets, whether it's Japan or some other Asian countries or Europe. So that is a big deal. And those debates are still ongoing, particularly in Europe as well. We can get into the technicalities of that. On the market side, we've given this a bit of thought. We certainly think maybe the simplest way to talk about this is to separate the molecules, hydrogen molecules, and the price of that from the potential pipeline infrastructure that one might require ultimately if you want to transport it over long distances. And kind of very typical microeconomic theory would say that, and this is certainly true in the hydrogen case, is that the market for the molecules should be viewed as a competitive industry that can be organized as a competitive industry. There can be many players in that market. It's like the power sector now. We've removed the licensing requirement for generation, and we should be encouraging multiple entrants that are competing to supply the renewables and the hydrogen, and not, I think we should regulate the pricing of that. And of course, our antitrust competition authorities will be keeping an eye on this market like any other market, and if there are real issues, they will be able to intervene. And then on the infrastructure side, there it becomes a bit more interesting, because if you are building a long, large pipeline system, then you have a natural monopoly infrastructure that economically would be best shared between players. And in that case, I think we need to think not in the first place about how you regulate it, but how you set it up institutionally. So we would like to see that to be institutionally separately owned from the competitors in the hydrogen market itself. Thank you.
I think let's leave it there. I mean, yesterday we had from Namibia about a 2,500 kilometer pipeline that is envisaged. Hopefully they'll do a better job than the one from Durban to the Vaal that transports fuel, and people still steal the fuel in hundreds of thousands of liters. Prof. Simon Roberts, let me come to you and start off one. This is quite an industry in its infancy, and of course, what do you think would be, we've spoken about some market-related regulations from Dr. Steyn now, but what do you think are some of the economic regulation for green hydrogen market, precisely because I mean, there's still new thinking about it. In one of the panels, for example, talking about economic regulation was how do you not leave communities behind where activities around green hydrogen are happening, and make sure that, you know, they are part of the economic thinking and regulation. Of course, an example was made with mining, you know, that in mining, we do think of communities when we talk about economic regulation in the form of social and labor plans. And the second one would be, what are the prospects of developing green hydrogen economy in South Africa without having a green industrial policy or strategy?
Thanks very much. Thanks for those questions. I should highlight that I'm a regulatory and competition economist, but that's not about regulation in terms of communities. But I also want to make the point that the biggest opportunities here in terms of the economic development in communities is actually job creation in the downstream industries that are going to be dependent on this transition happening. I think the one thing that's come through very clearly is the debate has moved dramatically in the last 1 to 2 years from looking at this as something which is costs that have got to be borne to saying this is actually a growth strategy. So we have a growth strategy here. Now the question is this a growth strategy for upstream, or is this a growth strategy for the downstream industries that are going to be ultimately users of this? And in terms of the regulatory system that we have, in terms of the, I don't think there's a difference between the economic regulatory system and the market regulatory system. So I'm going to be saying some of the same things that Grover has already said. First of all, we have to have a regulatory system which is clear, transparent, and independent. This is very important. We need to say this very clearly. And why do we need to say this? Because we have to be really honest about the energy regulatory system we have. It's a patchwork, and it's really a bit of a mess. Because you have NERSA regulating some parts of it, and regulating pipelines differently. So the pipelines are not all regulated on the same basis, right? Then you've got government regulating parts of it, which are fuels. And then you have the competition authorities regulating, through competition law, other parts of it. All of this doesn't work very well. We can see this. I mean, I think we're all living with the consequences. And it takes an awful long time. And what we know is that we need really clear rules to support those investments in the critical infrastructure. We need to regulate for competitive rivalry, where that rivalry can happen. This is very much in line. Khouria didn't collude exactly, but we certainly had a line on it. But you know, there's an opportunity, a massive opportunity for investment if there are these clear rules that are there, and regulate the parts of it where you need to support those big investments, and you know they're going to be natural monopolies. So this is transmission grid and the pipelines. Okay? So we need to set out those principles really clearly. We need to say this, I think, because any investor looking at the last 10 to 20 years would be like, whoa, I have no certainty about how this is going to play out. If I look at the record, all I know is I need to hire the best law firms in Sandton, and I need to retain them now, right? Because it's been lawfare. So it's really been lawfare around this stuff that's been going on for a long period of time. So we need to do that. And we need to have the institutional capacity in terms of the skills to do it, and we need to have dispute resolution. Now, just to draw a kind of link to other developments that are taking place in a dynamic space, because this is very dynamic, not static, where we're saying, you know, how much should the price of data be, for example. It's dynamic because we need to regulate for these investments and for the rivalry and investment decisions around that. The other space where this is happening is around digital platforms. So that's very dynamic. And competition authorities in Europe and South Africa also doing this. They say we can't have cases that take 10 years to resolve. This is like the Microsoft case. It's too late. By the time we've resolved it, it's like the technology has stopped. So we have to have arbitration mechanisms. We have to have decision making, which is independent, objective. And it's a bit like saying we have a VAR. You may not like the results. We're going to take it. There's 5 minutes, and then there's the decision, and then the game goes on. And so you do this. It's no fault decision making. You're not having a legal case with massive damages at stake, right? Which means you will fight forever, and you've got to protect the rights of the respondents, right? You're having decision-making where we're saying, we know we need new rules, and we're going to make those rules, access to data, advertising, booking.com kind of positioning. This is all happening. So we can learn from that, and that's what we need in the energy space. But it mustn't allow for government discretion in there, because that means that you're just going to have to hire the lawyers and take whoever to court, right? You need to have it in a space where it can take place, the decisions are made, and investors know, okay, I can put a balance of probabilities on this, and I know I'll be able to adjust my models, and it reduces uncertainty. If I like the answer, I don't like the answer, but I know where I'm going with this. So that's what we need, I think, around the regulatory regime. We need to put those principles out very clearly while we're working out the regime. So we need to start working out the regime now, but we need the principles to go up really early so that investors can say, I know this is where South Africa is going with this. On the linkages in industrial policy, your second question, these are both huge questions. So the big thing I think for me is that we need to be thinking about all the demand side. We're talking about fertilizer, ammonia is fertilizer and explosives. That's mining and agriculture. They're not part of the conversation. But that's ammonia, right? That's where all the ammonia goes, basically, fertilizers and explosives. So the case for this in a 10 to 15 to 20 year time horizon is actually those downstream industries where the region, not just South Africa, but the region, these are really, really important industries. These industries in the whole region, we're not the ammonia or the fertilizer suppliers for South Africa, we're a supplier for the whole region, right? And that includes some of the best places in the world to expand agricultural production. I mean, Zambia is the best place in the world to expand agricultural production sustainably right now, right? Where should that fertilizer be coming from? Should be coming from here, Cape Town, a little bit further north, right? So we need to be thinking from an industrial policy perspective now about that demand side. It's quite a long way off. It's certainly out with the 10-year time horizon, but the investment decisions need to be happening within the next 10-year time horizon for when all of those regulations globally will come in.
Well, I suppose, Frederico, that puts us squarely onto your question about, green hydrogen markets and, this new renewable energy capacity. You are going to need some long-term takeoff agreements. One of the big discussions yesterday with some people thinking about finance is really you've got your pre-feasibility stages and so on, but some people really like to get involved when there's a commercial case and you've got those long-term takeoff agreements that are needed. So what would you say, in terms of the double auctions for hydrogen generation capacity and offtake might provide, a market stimulus, but what is the regime that we should focus on? Is it the contract for difference, the right system to be put in place? That's one. And secondly, of course, thinking about an enabling environment for the private sector to be involved with green hydrogen technologies across the value chain. And yesterday we spoke to Siemens, we spoke to ArcelorMittal and so on, talking about these, downstream value chains that Prof. Roberts is talking about. What would be the 2 or 3 policy actions that are necessary to be put in place for an effective green hydrogen implementation strategy?
Right. I should get an award if I get this right, eventually. And probably if you ask to the Germans and the colleagues from H2 Global, I don't know if anybody is here. No, I don't see them. Anyway, they will tell you, yes, the CFD, the contract for difference, is the right mechanism. Actually, it's quite interesting to see how big expectations are behind that mechanism, because I think the first auction is about to be published. I think is very, very much imminent, and there is a lot of interest from the market to check whether this is gonna work. For sure, that is a very good mechanism because it stimulates both supply and demand, which is exactly what you want to do, because at the end you need to create a new market irrespectively of what it is traded. If green hydrogen molecules, you need a supplier and somebody who is buying that product. So I think that's a very healthy mechanism. However, I think here is very interesting also to look at developing countries and developed countries, because the situation is a little different. The contract for difference could be happening in everywhere, no? Because provided you have a supplier and a buyer, that system would work. And this is also the objective of the H2 Global mechanism, right? Which is backed up by the German government, AAA investment, but still it's also inviting private sector entities from all over the world, even government, to chip in and join that mechanism. But if you look at developing countries, though, I think the CFD might not be enough, because what you would need is also some type of concessional financing, because as of today there is no green hydrogen project which is financially sustainable per se. It needs some kind of concessional financing in the form of grant, whatever you wanna look at that. So for developing countries, you need also some development finance. So meaning that some pre-feasibility studies to ascertain the investment potentials, the project, and even some capacity building. So it's a package. I don't think you have just one single mechanism that, especially for developing countries, would work to make all the market ramp up. So I think it's a combination of things. So, but technical assistance is definitely needed, especially because you need to make sure that the rules of the game are clear. Otherwise, you won't have investors being interested in your market. In terms of policy actions that you want to look at to make this happen, well, I think many countries globally are doing their roadmap, developing their roadmap and strategies, which I think is quite a healthy approach, because you want to make a good plan eventually, right? So you want to make sure that you need to study, because hydrogen has a kind of big problem. It's very much polyhedric, so it impacts a lot of sectors of the economy. So if you want to make it right at country level, you need to study, you need to make a real roadmap and a strategy. They are very much healthy processes. And also it entails a lot of stakeholders engagement, because it potentially brings in some conflict among the stakeholders, because you would have a Ministry of Transport that will try to pull the rope, no? Again, oh yeah, we need to do heavy load vehicles powered by hydrogen. Then you would have the Ministry of Energy, no, we need to use it for storage. Or you want to have then the agricultural sector say, no, bring me ammonia, it's easier. So those processes, so developing a green hydrogen policy, meaning roadmap and strategy, is very good for this purpose in particular, to make the various stakeholders thinking about which are the priorities of your country. And at the end of the day, they change country by country. Clearly, there are low-hanging fruits from which you need to start, like, for example, ammonia, especially, I would say, for Africa, which is very much agricultural-based region. I think that's definitely one of the low-hanging fruits. And also, I mean, this roadmap, they are very much in fashion, and I'm involved in a number of them, and I see that at the end they are healthy because you prepare a good plan, and this is definitely what is needed. And the plan ends also with analysis of all the sectors, the measures, all the enabling environment. No, we know what is needed. You need the policy, dedicated hydrogen policy, you need a regulatory framework, and you need partnership, economic measures, and also eventually looking at the finance, how to make this financially worth. And you were asking also the 2-3 main policy actions. I think out of all of these sea of interventions that you will need, what I usually suggest to countries that get clarity on who is leading on hydrogen in your country. So if you have a hydrogen interministerial committee, or so, make sure that there is one entity that you refer to, and its role should be to have representative of the main sectors and make them work together, because otherwise you will have a lot of barriers. And then bring clear rules for the market, the so-called one-stop shop. That is probably more important than having a fantastic regulatory framework in place, because the investor will say, yes, if I go there, in particular for the renewable energy development, which is no renewable energy, no green hydrogen, no? It's very simple. So if you have a very clear and rapid authorization mechanism for the renewable energy, I think you are already ahead of the game for this.
Well, thank you, Frederica. I'm sure the South Africans in the room, when you mention interministerial committee, they think, God, how many more do we need? Because there are just so many. Alexandra, I mean, Federico is talking about, consensual finance, but let's talk a bit about, incentives. What are the kind of incentives that we need for the green hydrogen market? And I mean, here includes from your tax breaks to everything else. But I do want to also add, how do we get to a point where there is transparency on the kind of incentives that are given to sectors? Because currently, talking about that one-stop shop, I don't know where I would go to find out what incentives various deals, bilateral, multilateral, are on in this country. And it has been a big talking point about how do we make sure that incentive regimes are, one, transparent, secondly, make a business case for the country, because at the end of the day, SAGHS must get something. So if you give too many breaks, I mean, I'm sure you remember some time back, the big BHP Billiton and ESCOM scandal that, BHP was still on on a kilowatt per hour cost from like the 70s and so on, and it becomes a scandal when it gets public. So one, how do we think of incentives for green hydrogen market? But I think, how do we think for transparency in those incentives? And secondly, what do you think are some of the major risks that are faced by green hydrogen developers, and what can be put in place to try and cushion those risks?
Okay, thanks everybody. I mean, I think from an incentives perspective, and I would add, I'm not a tax advisor, nor am I an economist, but what I can say is that, watching the markets evolve globally, because I think certainly the green hydrogen space is a kind of global iterative process at the moment in terms of the various markets in the world sort of wrapping their minds around how they can encourage this industry to take off. And looking at any market, I mean, I think it's a balance between, providing incentives, whether it's tax breaks or some other form of fiscal incentive, against the benefits, obviously, of investment. So naturally, what comes out of one pocket hopefully goes in the other, in the sense that you're encouraging investment to come into the country. And, we've certainly seen, not necessarily only by tax breaks or things like that, but certainly if you provide an enabling environment, and whilst there were bumps in the road, I think the renewables programs and the energy liberalization has still formed one of the biggest sources of foreign direct investment in this country. So certainly once a sector does come off the ground, it can prove very lucrative for a country. And in that context, obviously, I think the incentives, or rather the combination of incentives and perhaps penalties, it's a carrot stick type approach, and you sort of need probably some combination of the two. I mean, the stick is probably coming through things like carbon taxes. In any event, the global approach, the commitments to net zero, the private sectors, the financiers, they're all going to drive how the markets behave, because at some point we're going to have to decarbonize, and obviously hydrogen is one of those. So Sassel was mentioned. These big industry users are going to be the ones that are driving the bus at the moment, in the sense that they need to get there, and they are going to be some of the major catalysts in this sector. And obviously we mentioned things like the H2 Global as an incentive. That's obviously something that hopefully we'll see play out in a really positive way. We've seen in America that the Inflation Reduction Act is really driving sort of energy transition behavior as well. So those are examples of what could be done. Regulatory certainty was another one that has been alluded to a number of times on this panel, and I think it's really critical. Obviously, at the moment, I think there's no immediate hurdle to the development of green hydrogen, but as alluded to, the more transparency, regulatory certainty, and enabling environment you create, the more likely the development of an industry is. So we have a large value chain here. We've got the renewables on the one side, but you've got desalination, you've got electrolysis, etc., in the whole value chain before you get to the hydrogen on the other end. And we need to also make sure that, and we speak about interministerial committees, and maybe the answer is not more of those, but certainly a driver of the entire value chain process, so that between the various departments that would be responsible for the various components and the regulatory environment relating to that, that there's some form of holistic approach and coordination between them, including also in the permitting process, so that you make sure that your entire process is permitted ideally at the same time. So that's what I would say in the context of sort of government's role overall. And then I think your next question was, what are the risks for developers in this environment? I mean, naturally, one of the major ones, and I think it's been alluded to many times, is in order to get to a financeable project and a big project off the ground, it's offtake. You know, everybody knows that in order to get a large capex investment off the ground, like these would invariably be, you need to know what your revenue stream is going to look like. And in a nascent market, without any kind of benchmarking that can be done, you're going to need offtake certainty. So that's really where you know, the role of heavy industry who is going to be off-taking and potentially incentives that they can benefit from in Europe, and we speak about the export market particularly for that reason, but also policy drivers in the region. We spoke about, you know, fertilizer and the like. So if there is policy, for example, that in whatever time horizon, you know, fertilizer needs to be green, then that will drive how the market behaves. You know, so I think a coordination around all of those things to ensure certainty of offtake is critical, because otherwise the projects won't go off the ground. You'll have a lot of pilots, because those can be financed on a small scale basis, often by equity themselves. You know, Anglo has built a green hydrogen for its trucks, but to get to giga scale type hydrogen projects, you're going to need certainty of offtake, and that's probably some sort of combination of predominantly export initially and, you know, regional use. And then I think the third-party infrastructure was also mentioned. Obviously, you know, we need ports for this stuff to be exported from. What does that interface look like? You know, we need to make sure that the environment works from end to end. So it's all very nice if you build a huge green hydrogen facility and then you don't have a route to market at the same time. So I think those kind of things need to be thought about quite carefully. And funding is another one, and we've sort of spoken about it, seed capital in particular. There are various, you know, grants programs available. Obviously, again, when you're talking about big industry users like the SAGHS of this world, they might have the ability to fund more upfront than some of the smaller scale developers, but certainly seed feasibility funding is a critical one. I'll leave it there.
Yeah, thank you. Oh, the room has gotten larger. Good morning and welcome. Let's get some comments and questions from the floor. I've got one here, 2, 3. Okay, just please introduce yourself and then, yeah, put the question.
Hi there, yeah, Jack Hoss of Gauteng Provincial Government. So just my question is kind of split between Grove and Simon to some extent. So the CFD mechanism that Federico is talking about presumes that a period during which, as Grove is saying, the cost of producing electricity from green H2 is going to be higher, for example, than the cost of producing it from any other source. So you've got a strike price, you've got an LCCC, somebody pays the difference. That's my very layman's understanding of a CFD. And so but the way that power purchase agreements are being written in practical terms actually goes well beyond the point that a CFD would naturally end, in the sense that you're getting 30-year PPAs. During the course of those PPAs, those industries are going to have to transition to a source most likely like green H2. So the question that presents itself in the industrial engagements we're having on, for example, dedicated microgrids that will potentially use green H2 is, well, you might start off at whatever, $4 or $5 a kilogram, but you assume by year 15, 16, 17, it's going to be a hell of a lot lower than that. It's going to be, you know, well below maybe the 95 cents a kilowatt hour, for example, that Eskom currently charges itself to produce from coal. So if you take an average over that period, the likelihood is you could lock in a rate of electrical generation or power generation, at least, using something like green H2, that could take an average of the costs over that period. And if you're writing 30-year deals, it means you might very well see industrial users pricing in this kind of thinking now, which is because that's some of the situations that we're dealing with. In that kind of case, and this is where Alexandra's comments, I think, come to bear as well, and this is what I wanted to bounce off maybe all of you, I guess, is that you're going to create a level of aggregators in the system. Because what we're asked all the time is, okay, where are we going to get the stuff from? So sure, up front it's going to be Sasol producing in Sasolburg. It's going to be a certain number of projects that can produce it and supply it. How it gets supplied in a zero carbon way, by the way, also has all kinds of regulatory weirdness because it's got to be transported. You're not going to have pipelines straight away. Probably have to put it on hydrogen capable trucks. Got to regulate those. So yeah, it's that end-to-end point you were making. But for the meantime, you've got a situation where only a certain number of players are going to be able to deal with supply and provide assurance of supply over something like a 30-year period. You're going to get returns to scale. And I think competition authorities, I suppose it's a little bit more of a Simon question, does it create natural monopolies? Are we headed for a competition blood fight on that issue? Thanks.
Thank you so much. Blood fight.
Thank you. My name's Sebastian. I'm from Yacht Fixing Solutions, Southern Africa. You've inspired me to be a bit controversial, so I have two questions. I'll be quick. For Dr. Steyn, is it a benefit not having the hydrogen in the IRP? Because we've seen that the IRP has been played with and it's been delayed, etc. And also hearing to what some of the other panels have said, where the use of Hive, for instance, have seen that the growth of their plant has attracted more investment and attracted other players into the market. So to let this being an opportunity for hydrogen to grow organically without the constraints of an IRP or too much legislation. And then secondly, for the economists or whoever's willing to bite, does the carbon tax mechanism not provide a levelization mechanism that incentivizes green hydrogen? The risk of having too many layers of levelization, making it inefficient and stifling other industries. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, and thanks to the panelists for excellent, real information that they imparted to us. Not to be controversial, let me hide behind. Oh, my name is Thabo Chauke from GIZ. Not to be controversial, maybe let me hide behind some of the words that were uttered by T.S. Eliot in the poem The Hollow Man, that between the idea and the shadow falls, between the idea and reality falls the shadow. So I'm saying this in the context of what I've been hearing since I arrived here. Sasol's role is so prominent in any talk about green hydrogen. So for me, the question is it a cause for celebration or a cause for concern? Indeed, the market, green hydrogen is a nascent market, but certainly not to Sasol. To Sasol, probably we are talking about switching from grey to green. So how is it feasible that we can expect that competition policy will be enough to address such a strong incumbent? I don't foresee, in my view, and probably I need someone to educate me otherwise, that it will be a bloodbath. I just see Sasol running short over everybody, and that for me it's a worry. So the question is, competition policy, will it be enough to address some of these concerns? Thanks.
Okay, I'll give my panel a chance to respond. It seems like they're saying Sasol is just switching colors from gray to green, and that's what's happening. But Prof. Simon, I also think the last time there was a Kumbaya moment was 2010, and we know exactly what that did for the infrastructure build program and competition problems. When there's this pulling together, because of course there's an end goal that must be delivered. But there was massive collusion during that process. So I'll also ask you to answer that about, when there's a Kumbaya moment, how do you avoid this competition problem? Yeah. And I'll start off with you, and then we can... No, you can start, Prof. Roberts.
Okay. Thanks for great questions. I feel like some people know and other people don't, but I was the chief economist of the Competition Commission from 2006 to 2012. So I think Lucanio knew this. So I know a lot about the stadiums.
Naturally.
Very firsthand, and also I spent a lot of time working on cases involving Sasol. So I guess that's important just to declare. I think starting with this, with Taba's question last, I think having gone through the process of the last 3 decades or so, this is where I think as South Africa we need to really sit down and say, where are we now? And I think this is really important in terms of leadership in business as well as leadership in government. If we look at the leadership in business, I think the big businesses are, they have incredible capabilities, they have incredible abilities to invest. People say, because you're the Competition Commission, you don't like Sasol. I'm like, no, Sasol is an incredible company. Sasol is incredible, and it's not going away. It's still that. But what this framework looks like and the decisions that are made are going to shape the next number of decades. And I think if we're looking at where the debate is at now, it's moved a long way because now it's a growth strategy. But it's a growth strategy that looks to me largely like enclaves for export. And I think we've got to think about whether that is going to mean in 10 years' time, if there isn't more diversified growth in the economy, whether there will be an economy. Because at the same time as we're looking at the imperative of transitioning to green hydrogen, we really need to think about what economy is that located within. And so I think that the lessons are clear in that we have to be thinking about how this is part of a genuine partnership for more diversified growth and employment creation in the economy. Otherwise, we might achieve this transition, but not address any of the wider structural issues in the economy. That might make it harder at one level to contemplate, but we've learned an enormous amount over the last 30 years, right? We've learned an enormous amount, I think, about how economies work and how political systems work. So it's a very high level question, but I think in terms of whether competition policy will be enough, we have to have rules for markets, right? We have to have rules for markets just like we have to have rules for professional sport, which governs, drug taking, whatever, all the way through to the rules around, the scrum, whatever. So we need to have rules. This is not do we have competition law or not? This is about what kind of rules do we want to have and what kind of referee do we want to have. And the big participants also have an interest in this. Because if this doesn't work, then your political system and social compact doesn't work, right? And we need to be really clear about this. That will not work. There will be a much bigger change. At the same time, there is an enormous opportunity because we potentially have the ability to be low down on the cost curves of all of these industries, and we are located in a region with massive potential on the demand side. Like I said, and we're not looking at this. Because we really are looking down at our feet at the moment, I think. We're not looking up and seeing this wider potential in the region. So this is a leadership and vision thing, but we really need rules, and we really need a competition authority or something similar, which is going to be the referee, and we need to enable that referee to take independent, objective decisions quickly, and we need to allow that to happen through some kind of process, which I would characterize as kind of arbitration type process, where you might not like it, but you understand how it was decided, right? You understand how it was decided. It wasn't decided through the back door. So I think this is the rethinking of the competition regime, which is a markets regime, is absolutely critical. And internationally, competition authorities are becoming markets authorities, right? In other words, they are gathering data real time because there's a lot more data out there that you can gather actually at relatively low cost because it's all digitalized. If you have the capacity in the institution to gather it. You can gather data quickly, you can synthesize and put this data together, and you can say this is the decisions we need to take. You can actually do that. You have to invest in the institutional capacity to do so, okay? And so this might look like a kind of overpowerful regulator, but in actual fact, it could be a lighter touch regulator, in actual fact, because you're not imposing massive penalties, which means you'll go to court forever. You're saying, what are the rules that we need? And we need to be able to have a more iterative approach around that rulemaking because it's a very dynamic environment that we're in. So that's a long answer and hasn't dealt with all the other questions. The last point I want to make is that it's not about, my layperson's understanding is it's nothing about the price today, the relative prices today. We need to be saying, it's about the relative price, where it will be, which will depend on all the investments that have been made in the future, 10 years' time. If you're Lafarge, Wholesome Lafarge, or PPC, whatever, you're thinking about a situation where the cement industry and your global shareholders, regardless of whether it's, we're not exporting cement, so it's not going to be on the export side, but there will be, if you're a global industry, your shareholders say, you need to be zero carbon, right? And to do that, these things all have to work for you. So is our cement industry going to be high cost because we have this really kind of messed up regime, or is our cement industry going to, in the future, more than 10 years or far out, because those investment decisions will be happening in the next period, is it going to be relatively low cost because this is a relatively effective rule-making system which allows a Holcim Lafarge or PC to make those decisions, because that's where they are, I think, right now. And obviously Sasol, ArcelorMittal, etc. are all in the same kind of situation. But where we are now, that's not what we need to be thinking about in terms of relative prices.
Okay. Thanks, Prof. Roberts. Dr. Steyn?
Thank you. I'll start with some of Jack's questions. I think it's just useful to remind ourselves that we need to be very clear about the distinction between the power market and PPA, power procurement agreements, and how that's going to evolve, the whole power market, number one. Secondly, the market for green hydrogen, and that's where the CFG question that I think you raised come in. And of course, then thirdly, the markets for the products that make use of green hydrogen. So it's just useful to be very clear about the distinction between those. So to come to your question about the power market, I thought that was what you were asking about. I think we have to understand that the future is not going to be like the past, right? So the idea of having a 20-year PPA with a REAP-type procurement process is over. It's history. The future of power procurement in South Africa, primarily, we still have the REAP, but the REAP is going to fade slowly in time, in my view. That's what we see. What's going to happen is the corporate market, the C&I market, is going to be the dominant provider of power in our economy going forward, particularly of new power. And they are not going to have government guarantees. And a further important point that we need to get our heads around, and I haven't fully understood this myself, but is that if you carry a long-term PPA on your balance sheet, it's a liability on your balance sheet in terms of IFRS, right? And that creates a huge problem. So many firms are not going to be able, just for that reason alone, to sign long-term PPAs. But there is another reason, and that is that, just think about this for a minute, very interesting problem, we've built a lot of modeling on this, is the learning curves are still in place. So the cost of the technology, whether it's renewables, storage, or even hydrogen electrolyzers, of course, is still coming down. So if you buy power today on a 20-year PPA, which, compared to buying it on a 10-year PPA, all things being equal, will be cheaper. But if your competitor is going to buy that power 5 years from now, they're going to get it cheaper, and then you're locked into a high input cost, right? So how's that all going to work out, right? So we have to think about that. And of course, what is happening, and we're seeing this with some of our clients, is that the market is moving to shorter term PPAs. And it's still a big range. You still might get the odd 20-year, but mostly 15. Some people are talking about 3-year PPAs, right? 5-year, 3-year PPAs. And then what they have to do is they know that 5 years from now, when this contract is going to run out and I have to resell that power, I'm selling it into a new market where the costs have dropped. So that means the market price for the power now will have to be a little bit higher so that they can afford to drop the price in future as the market. So it's a very different market that we're going into. So I think and of course this is important, this whole complexity, because roughly 60% of the cost of green hydrogen is the cost of power. So you can see why, as this process plays out, in a sense, the economic viability of the hydrogen will depend on as the cost of corporate power supplies becomes affordable and makes hydrogen work. So I'll leave it there. Then just quickly, Sebastian's question about the IRP and what do I mean if I say it's. So I think the distinction is. The IRP is primarily supposed to be about energy security for the power market, which for the South African power sector, which of course it's completely failed to achieve. Right? So it's not about providing power for hydrogen production. So I think what's going to happen is that essentially the IRP as we know it today, the role for the IRP is gone. So the IRP had legal force until recently, as the law was interpreted, because NERSA would not issue a license for generation if somebody couldn't either show that that project complies with the IRP, or the minister would provide an exemption from compliance with the IRP. Now, of course, now that the licensing requirement is being discarded, it's currently at 100 megawatt, and the commitment is to remove it entirely. That role for the IRP as a legal mechanism is gone, right? And the second point is that it's looking like as I said just now, most of the new power will in any case come from market players, right? So they're not going to say, well, where's the central plan and I must follow the central plan. They're going to find themselves buyers for the power and make investment decisions like in any other market on that basis. So, so that's just how the paradigm is probably shifting. And then I think the role for the IRP becomes, and perhaps for the system operator more than the politically controlled process in government, is to produce forward-looking plans to see whether what we're observing in the market with all this data that Simon is talking about is likely to give us a secure power system as we go into the future and make that information public. That's what you see in other countries with system operators, etc. So that's more kind of a feedback role. And then, of course, the role of the state is if all of this fails, and we need to save the economy from load shedding in future, then there's a role for the state to step in. Then the question about power supply for hydrogen. So in a way, I'm almost, because hydrogen, green hydrogen would be a completely new industry. And as we heard yesterday, the power demand for green hydrogen, as it is projected, is actually bigger than our total power demand today. So in a way, it's like, again, the whole paradigm shift. In a way, really, the hydrogen industry is going to have to supply its own power, right? And what we would like to see, and this brings me to one last point I want to make, is that we'd like to see that the existing power market for the rest of the economy can benefit from that, right? And particularly because there'll be, in principle, lots of surplus power from the hydrogen supply, because they'll have to supersize the plant to provide power throughout the day, which means in the middle of the day, if you're running solar or other wind peak times, there'll be surplus power. And we should be able to benefit from that in the rest of the power system. However, none of this is going to work if we don't have grid capacity, right? So that is the single largest invisible elephant in the room today, is that we do not have a credible strategy in place to massively expand our power grid, and we're running out of capacity on the grid, as everybody knows. And that would be
that's the final point.
The key issue.
Thank you, Dr. Stein. Federico?
Well, I fully agree. I think the grid it looks likely really the bottleneck for the big hydrogen development, not just in developing countries, but in worldwide, I would say. So I think massive investment on grid upgrade should start. That's also why many countries are looking at the export as the first choice, no? Because you can develop renewable energy outside the grid, and this is also the case of South Africa, because I mean Eskom wouldn't be very much happy to receive a lot of new renewable energy to handle. And so though countries that are really exposing themselves on export-only strategies, I think that's a risk, because then you are kind of following the bad pattern that we have now, no? That, okay, it's cheap there, so I will get it from there, like that we did mainly with the fossil fuels. So I think an ideal hydrogen strategy will be a combination of export, but also as a leverage to build some local market, because this will make it so much more healthier in terms of global market development. And for sure, there will be new countries that are new energy exporters, and the hydrogen will become a big commodity, but still relying on your strategy only on export, I don't think is healthy, even though you have a lot of resources. And it would be interesting, for example, to see what Namibia would do, because they have massive resources, but very, very tiny industry. So I think the challenge there is that take advantage of those resources to make a big shift in their industrialization, so a green industrialization. So I think that could be quite an interesting point for them to do. And also this, I think, speaks also to the goodness of green hydrogen, because it also incentivizes the renewable energy deployment. And so I think it's really the way for the net zero on this, and even to make a bigger market, because also the electron market is limited in a way, no? Also because the grid at this infrastructure level are limited. So the green molecules and the derivatives are definitely helping to diversify that market, which is not infinitive instead. And I think the other colleagues have more or less replied to the main points.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just to add additional observations there in terms of both the IRP and the PPA structure. I mean, I think, as you said, the output in a hydrogen context is not the power, it's the molecule, and so your value chain is a huge, construct between renewables, the electrolyzers, the desalination potentially, or whatever your water source is. So you're likely, from a kind of legal construct perspective, if you're trying to finance the whole thing, you're probably looking at a situation where you're lobbing all of that together rather than trying to disaggregate it, because that creates more and more sort of project on project risk, which adds further complexity. So you're sort of almost putting the hydrogen, the power that's fueling the hydrogen into that construct, meaning it'll invariably be a long-term situation. Whereas I agree, I think the actual kind of captive PPA market in this country is moving fairly rapidly, and one needs to distinguish between the utility scale stuff, which is still probably looking more longer term because you have to finance the power plants that are being built, and the sort of C&I rooftop space where you have portfolios and stuff where you can look a lot more creatively at term and tenor and pricing, etc. And that's a kind of alive, kind of moving market given the liberalization of late. And agreed, the role of the IRP, and speaking to NERSA about these things regularly, is while they have removed licensing requirements, and obviously hopefully soon there won't be a cap on that at all, you still need to register with NERSA, and it's used as a tool obviously for grid planning, and they still use the IRP as a reference point, but they're using different bits of it depending on where they're pulling the amounts from. So, if there is a plan for however many thousands of megawatts of solar, the captives sort of fall within those volumes at the moment. So they're still using it as a reference point, but it doesn't form the same, legal importance in the sense that it's not necessarily a restrictor, but certainly an energy planning mechanism, and NERSA still refers to it.
Thank you so much. I hope that the GIZ team will really feed in some of the input to, the powers that be and the authorities that be, because what I'm getting today is that, the policy environment itself is becoming reoriented entirely. And we've got to think in very different and dynamic ways. How do you create elastic, regulation, but at the same time not, contaminating the space to such an extent that it fosters these monopolies. And of course, I'm sure within no time we will see some people wanting to have vertical ownership. If I'm listening quite carefully, you're going to have players who want to own downstream, upstream, and have everything in one portfolio just to manage costs and all of these things, which will create further harm in terms of what some people yesterday were talking about, the role of SMMEs coming into this space and making sure that there's seed funding for as many players as possible, and not only relying on the big industry players who can self-seed fund and test their own heavy-duty, load trucks in the mines with hydrogen power and so on. So I think there's really a case to be made for policymakers to think very carefully. And my biggest concern from a strategy, policy and regulation point of view is that it seems like the industry has literally run far ahead of policymakers, and policymakers then have to play catch up. And for me, that can create imbalances and asymmetric power relations in terms of how we move forward and define that, underlying rules for the market, for example. It seems as if the market now self-creates its own rules, because maybe the policymakers, the state, have not moved enough in terms of getting that data and making sure that they keep abreast in real time as to what is happening and be able to respond in real time to that. So there's going to be a great debate, probably many fights as well, because once the players define the rules and you bring in a referee later, there's going to be a problem, because the rules are already defined and you want to redefine them. So I think this was a beautiful technical session on strategy, regulations and policies. Thank you very much, and a big round of applause for our panel. Thank you so much.